Lady Isobel Fairfax understood she was being destroyed before anyone spoke her name, because the music kept playing while every head in the ballroom turned. At the top of the marble stair, her maid Nora stood rigid, an envelope crushed in her fingers, and beside her lounged Lord Sterling with the composure of a man who has arranged the entertainment. For one suspended heartbeat, the chandeliers still glittered and the couples still moved through the waltz. But the air had changed, sharp and metallic, and Isobel felt it slide over her skin like cold water. She did not need to see the crest on the wax to know the letter bore her name. Sterling descended the steps at a measured pace, the letter balanced on his gloved palm, and the crowd parted before him without being asked. "Pray forgive the interruption," he said as he reached the center of the floor, his tone light, almost amused, "but a matter of delicacy has been brought to my attention concerning Lady Isobel Fairfax." His voice carried to every corner. Fans snapped open. Men shifted to make a ring. Isobel's father took half a step forward, then stopped, his face set, his gaze fixed on the rectangle of paper as though it were a snake. The wax broke with a crack that sounded louder than the orchestra. "It appears," Sterling continued, eyes bright, "that an assignation was arranged in the South Garden this very night, expressed in terms no modest young lady would ever commit to ink. I shall spare you the coarsest phrases. Perhaps Lady Isobel would simply explain how her name appears at the bottom, and why a footman swears he found this upon the path where a gentleman waited, alone and disappointed." A ripple of shocked laughter and outrage ran round the room. Isobel's limbs refused to move. It felt as though lead had been poured into her bones, while her disgrace ran from one pair of eyes to another. She had written no such note, had planned no meeting, yet there in Sterling's hand lay her name in a sweep of ink that mimicked her own to cruel perfection. If she denied it, they would call her brazen. If she wept, guilty. If she remained silent, they would take that silence as confession. Her father's voice cut through the murmur, harsh with a fury she had never heard turned upon her, declaring that no daughter who dragged their name through filth would remain under his roof another day. The sentence fell before she had spoken a word. At the edge of the circle, leaning against a marble pillar, the Duke of Ashbourne straightened, dark gaze sharpening as he traced the progression from accusation to judgment, and in the timing, the witnesses and the letter he saw, not a foolish girl exposed, but the clean lines of a trap laid with ruthless care, a snare set for his interests as deliberately as for her ruin. Her life ended in whispers. At dawn the following morning, the Fairfax house became a place of corridors and closed doors, as if overnight it had decided she were a contagion to be contained rather than a daughter to be heard. Footmen who had once leapt to open doors for Lady Isobel Fairfax now studied the carpet when she passed, stepping aside without meeting her eyes, and the maids who had chattered over ribbons the day before smoothed their aprons in silence. Her mother sent no message to her room, no summons, no offer of explanation. Only the housekeeper came, stiff and uncomfortable, to inform her that the Earl required her trunks to be packed for a journey north, and that a carriage would be ready within the hour. Exile, it seemed, would not be a slow, sorrowful drift but a brisk piece of household business, accomplished before luncheon, so that the household could return to its preferred state of pretending nothing unpleasant ever happened beneath its roof. Isobel folded gowns with hands that shook and would not cry, because tears would have made everything feel too real. She moved from wardrobe to trunk in a tight, efficient circle, placing between layers of muslin the life that had been declared over in a single evening, knowing she was permitted to keep only what would not be missed. When she descended to the hall at last, cloak over her plainest walking dress, her father was waiting, hat and gloves on, as though he were about to step out for some ordinary call rather than to send his eldest child away from everything she had ever known. He did not ask if she had slept or if she was well. He merely extended a folded paper and informed her, in the same tone he used to discuss tenants' rents, that arrangements had been made for her residence at a cottage overlooking Blackthorn Bay, that a modest allowance would be remitted quarterly, and that she was not to write to any acquaintance in town until advised otherwise. If she attempted to contradict the narrative that had already hardened around her name, he said, she would only make matters worse for them all. For them all, not for her. She listened, words rolling past like gravel, and heard in each syllable the choice he had made. He would rather sacrifice his daughter than allow society to question his judgment. She bowed her head, because there was nothing left to say, and walked out between pillars she had run past as a laughing child, into a carriage that smelled of leather and starch. As London streets blurred into fields and then into the harsher lines of the northern countryside, humiliation began to loosen its grip, leaving behind something leaner and colder. If they meant to bury her at the edge of the sea, she thought, staring at the strip of sky above the carriage window, then she would learn to breathe underwater before she gave them the satisfaction of drowning. Lady Isobel Fairfax arrived at Blackthorn Bay long after dusk, though the sky still held the faintest rim of iron-blue light that made the sea glimmer like something half alive and wholly unfriendly. The carriage jolted to a halt on a narrow cliff road, and when the footman opened the door, salt wind rushed in with enough force to snatch her breath and sting her eyes. She stepped down onto uneven ground, her boots sinking into cold, wet earth, and for a moment she simply stood, gripping her valise, listening to the roar of waves crashing against rocks far below. There were no gas lamps, no polished pavements, no soft chatter of society drifting from carriage windows, only wind, sea, and the lonely call of some distant night bird. The cottage assigned to her stood a short walk away, its stone walls weathered by decades of storms, its roof patched in places where the tiles had clearly lost battles against the wind. Smoke curled from its chimney in a thin, uncertain line. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Kersey, emerged holding a lantern up to Isobel's face, her expression brisk rather than welcoming, as if the girl before her were not a fallen aristocrat, but another piece of unexpected luggage delivered late. Without fuss, she led Isobel inside, pointing out the narrow kitchen, the single bedroom, and a hearth that would hold heat well enough if tended proper, all in a tone that suggested she expected neither complaint nor gratitude. When Mrs. Kersey left, shutting the door with a firmness that told Isobel her arrival was already old news, silence spread through the small cottage like an unwelcome guest. She set her valise on the rickety table and looked around at the rough plaster walls, the uneven floorboards, the plain wooden chair pulled close to the hearth. There was no mirror above the mantel, no soft carpet beneath her feet, no embroidered cushions or delicate porcelain ornaments. Everything she touched felt foreign, utilitarian, and entirely indifferent to her presence. She crossed the room slowly, each footstep whispering across cold wood, and knelt to coax the embers in the grate back into warmth with the small tinderbox left for her use. Her hands trembled only once, when a gust of wind rattled the shutters with such violence it sounded like a fist pounding to be let in. But she did not flinch long. Instead, she told herself that walls built for storms could withstand far worse than one banished woman. She lit the single candle by the bedside and watched its fragile glow push back the shadows. Alone, truly alone for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her new reality settle, a sensation not unlike stepping into the sea fully clothed, pulled down by everything she had once worn so lightly. Yet beneath the ache of humiliation and the hollow ringing of loss, something else stirred, faint but real, the awareness that here, at the very edge of England where society had cast her out, no one could dictate who she must be tomorrow. Exile had taken everything she recognized, but in its harsh, salt-stung emptiness lay the first breath of freedom she had ever tasted. London did not pause to consider the ruin of Lady Isobel Fairfax. It merely absorbed the scandal into its bloodstream and moved on to its next distraction. But Ilyas Ravenscroft, Duke of Ashbourne, did not move on. Long after the gossip sheets finished sharpening their quills upon her name, he sat in the deep leather chair of his private club, the murmur of aristocrats around him, blending with the low crackle of the fire, and listened to a conversation that slid, with polite subtlety, toward matters that made his blood run cold. The men spoke of Isobel's disgrace with the same tone they used to assess a horse, gone lame, regrettable, but useful if handled correctly. They mentioned the sudden vacancy of her influence in certain family holdings, the convenience of her removal from discussions about disputed northern lands tied, however faintly, to the Ashbourne estates. Their smiles were thin, their interest was sharp. It was the kind of talk Ilyas had been trained since boyhood to ignore, because ducal composure required distance, and distance required never allowing anything to appear personal. But he saw, in their precise phrasing and in the careful absence of names, the mark of orchestration. Sterling's handiwork was becoming clearer by the minute, and Isobel's ruin was not the unfortunate consequence of reckless flirtation or foolish innocence. It was a deliberate lever meant to shift property, inheritance, and influence like pieces on a chessboard, and Ilyas Ravenscroft recognized a gambit when it was laid before him. He left the club early, ignoring the surprised glances of men accustomed to his impeccable routine, and returned to his townhouse where his secretary, Harrow, waited with a stack of documents tied neatly with ribbon. The forged love letter had already been analyzed by two handwriting experts, both discreet, both puzzled by its striking accuracy. Harrow reported quietly that Sterling had been seen meeting with Fairfax solicitors weeks before the scandal erupted, though their conversations were always held behind closed doors. Threads were beginning to align into a pattern, one that made Elias's jaw tighten with controlled fury. He was a man known for iron composure, the kind whose emotions never breached the surface. Yet as he stood at the window, watching the lamps flicker along the street and hearing the distant rumble of night carriages, he felt something dangerous coil in his chest. He had admired Isobel from afar long before this, her quiet intelligence, the grace she carried even in the most crowded rooms, the way she seemed to listen more than she spoke. But admiration had never been permission to interfere. Society expected him to keep his distance, and Isobel herself had never imagined he saw her at all. But now she had been exiled, silenced, destroyed for a plot that touched his own borders and sought to manipulate him through her suffering. By morning, his decision was made with the clarity of steel. He announced to Harrow that he would travel north on estate business, though no one in London needed to know which estate or why. The Duke of Ashbourne was leaving the capital, breaking his own rules, and following a woman society had cast aside. He told himself it was strategy, justice, necessity, but the cold truth that settled in his chest as he boarded his carriage was far simpler and far more dangerous. He could not bear to leave her alone in exile. The village of Blackthorn Bay was the sort of place where a stranger might as well have arrived carrying a brass trumpet for all the subtlety such an appearance allowed, and Elias Ravenscroft realized this the moment he stepped out of the mail coach. Wind tore at his coat, seabirds wheeled overhead with suspicious cries, and a row of fishermen paused mid-repair of their nets to survey him with open curiosity. He had dressed plainly, his fine black coat exchanged for a simple, well-worn greatcoat, his boots scuffed deliberately, his cravat tied with a carelessness he would never tolerate in London. Even so, he carried himself like a man accustomed to space and silence and deference, and there was no disguising the fact that the stranger now standing in the middle of the muddy village square was not merely passing through. Introducing himself as Mr. Raven, he secured a modest room at the inn, where the innkeeper's wife eyed him with a skepticism that softened only when he complimented her spiced broth and pretended not to notice the draught under the door. He behaved as a man traveling for quiet business, asking after nearby estates, weather patterns and fishing yields, all while memorizing each alley and cliff path, mentally mapping the place where Isobel Fairfax had been quietly buried away. He saw her before she saw him. It was early morning, fog still clinging to the shoreline, when he walked the narrow path overlooking the bay and noticed a solitary figure standing where the cliff bent sharply toward the sea. She wore a dark wool gown, simple and unadorned, her hair pinned in a style that would have been considered plain in London but here looked fiercely practical. Her posture struck him. She stood with her back straight, despite the brutal wind, as if the sea itself had challenged her and she refused to yield an inch. Something in him tightened at the sight. Her disgrace had not hollowed her. It had refined her into something sharper, more resolute. But when she turned and caught sight of him, this stranger who was no stranger at all, her eyes widened, then hardened into something like anger before settling into a brittle, wary composure. She recognized him instantly. Of course she did. He was her ruin's silent witness, the man who had watched from a marble pillar as her life collapsed like fine lace soaked in ink. He descended the path slowly, offering the sort of polite greeting any traveler might give to a lone woman on a cliff, but her expression told him politeness would not soften her wounds. She demanded to know why he was here, her voice low and controlled, and whether he had come to observe what remained of the girl London had cast aside. He denied it, gently but firmly, and her disbelief scraped at him more deeply than he expected. Their first meeting on this windswept shore was brief, clipped, and fraught with everything neither dared speak aloud. Yet as she walked away, leaving him alone with the roar of the surf, Elias knew one truth with absolute certainty. Exile had not broken her, but it had changed her, and whatever lay ahead, he could not remain a distant spectator to her suffering. Isobel had hoped, fiercely, desperately, that her first encounter with Elias Ravenscroft in this place would be the last, but fate, it seemed, had grown fond of humiliating her. 2 days after their terse exchange on the cliff-top, she was walking the winding path toward the village with a basket of washed linens when the Duke, no, Mr. Raven, she corrected bitterly, appeared around a bend with the calm inevitability of someone who has planned his steps very carefully. The morning sun glinted off the water, throwing hard silver light into her eyes, but even half-blinded she could see the tension in the way he carried his shoulders, the deliberate neutrality in his expression. He greeted her as though their lives had not intersected at the jagged seam of her public ruin, a mild, "Good morning," delivered with courteous restraint. Isobel answered with a thin nod, intending to stride past him, but the path narrowed cruelly, forcing them within arm's reach. She felt his gaze, cool, measuring, faintly troubled, following the tremor in the basket she clutched too tightly. When he gently offered to carry it, she snapped that she was not in the habit of being assisted by men who appeared precisely where they were least wanted. It was petty, unfair, and absolutely true. Elias accepted the barb with a composed stillness that somehow infuriated her more than any protest could have. He stepped aside to give her room, but instead of leaving, he spoke quietly, saying he had come north because he believed her exile had been engineered and that she was not safe alone. The words were too calm, too steady, too dangerously close to kindness. Isobel's breath hitched, though she forced her face into ice. She told him that in London he had stood and watched while she was stripped of her dignity, offering not a single word in her defense, not even a glance of support, so his sudden concern rang hollow. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her restraint was sharper than any shout. His jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but it betrayed that the blow had landed. He finally answered, quietly, that stepping forward at the ball would have damned her faster, that any sign of allegiance from him, one of the most scrutinized men in the city, would have been read as proof of guilt and impropriety. He said it with the calm of someone who has lived under the weight of reputation long enough to know its cruelty intimately. Isobel wanted to believe him. Worse, she wanted not to, because if he was telling the truth, then she had been condemned not only by malice but by the unspoken rules that protected the powerful and broke the powerless. She told him she neither needed nor wanted a protector. He answered that she had one anyway. The silence that followed trembled between them, tight as a stretched wire. When she finally walked away, she felt his gaze lingering on her back, not possessive but watchful, almost pleading, as though he wished she would see his presence not as intrusion but as repentance. She refused to look back, not because she felt nothing, but because she felt far too much. The next time their paths crossed, there was no cliff, no wind, no sharp backdrop against which to hide the tension between them, only the narrow village lane, muddy from last night's rain, and Isobel's arms wrapped tightly around a sack of coal she could scarcely lift. She had refused the innkeeper's offer to send a boy to help her, determined to carry the burden herself, even as it dragged at her shoulders and scraped her palms. She was halfway across the lane when her foot slipped, the weight lurching dangerously, and before she could recover her balance the sack was lifted cleanly from her grasp. Elias stood beside her, breath steady, expression unreadable, holding the coal as if it weighed nothing. She opened her mouth to protest, to deliver some cutting remark that might reassert the thin shield of distance she clung to, but exhaustion and frustration tangled her tongue. Instead, she found herself walking beside him in stiff silence as he carried the sack toward her cottage, the two of them attracting curious glances from villagers who had clearly begun to assemble their own private stories about the pair. Inside her cottage, with the coal safely deposited by the hearth, the air thickened. Elias did not leave immediately. Instead, he removed his gloves with slow precision, as though unsure how close he was permitted to stand. He began to speak, not with commanding assurance but with the cautious sincerity of a man who understood he was treading on wounded ground, and told her plainly that he had not come to observe her downfall, nor to involve himself in matters that were none of his affair, but because he believed the scandal had been engineered to manipulate not only her family's affairs but his own. The forged letter, the conveniently timed accusations, the sudden pressure surrounding disputed northern lands, all of it formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. He explained, in measured tones, that staying near her allowed him to gather information safely, and that assuming the role of a landlord's agent made it possible to protect her without drawing the wrong sort of attention. Isobel listened, arms folded tightly across her waist, suspicion and reluctant understanding warring in her gaze. She asked, quietly, bitterly, whether he expected her to be grateful. He replied that he expected nothing at all, except perhaps that she allow him to remain nearby without hostility long enough to uncover the truth. She told him she did not need rescuing. He answered that what she needed was not rescue but partnership, because the men who had orchestrated her ruin were unlikely to stop with merely banishing her. The word partnership landed between them like a spark in dry tinder. In the end, she agreed, but only barely, and only on the condition that he never again presumed to make decisions for her. He accepted the term with a faint incline of his head, something like respect flickering in his eyes. As he stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Isobel felt a strange, unwelcome mix of resentment and relief. She did not trust him, but she trusted him more than she trusted anyone else left in her shattered world, and that truth unsettled her more deeply than any danger lurking beyond the cliffs. Life in Blackthorn Bay settled into a rhythm so unlike London that Isobel sometimes felt she had stepped sideways into a different lifetime rather than merely a different place. Each morning she walked the narrow path to the small schoolhouse, where Mrs. Penwick, the schoolmistress with her eternally ink-stained fingers, greeted her with grateful relief. Isobel quickly became indispensable, her clear handwriting and patient explanations turning arithmetic lessons from chaos into something almost orderly. Children who had first stared at her with wary curiosity now tugged at her sleeves, begging her to read to them or to settle disputes over stolen chalk. After lessons, she returned to the cottage to scrub dishes, mend worn hems, and coax the stove into grudging cooperation, discovering in each domestic victory a small, grounding satisfaction she had never been permitted in her old life. The days were hard, but they were mercifully full, leaving little space for the sharp edges of memory to bite at her heels. She saw Elias, unavoidably, though their interactions were rarely long and never easy. Sometimes she glimpsed him through the schoolhouse window, speaking with fishermen near the harbor in his assumed role as a landlord's agent, his sleeves rolled up as he helped haul crates as though he had been born to it. Other times he passed her on the road, offering a polite nod that hid a deeper, searching concern. Once, she found the leaking patch of her roof silently repaired, the work done while she was away at lessons, the tools neatly arranged beneath the eaves. The innkeeper claimed it was the landlord's generosity, but the faint scent of Elias's cologne on the newly tarred shingles told her otherwise. She should have been furious at the presumption. She was furious, for approximately an hour, but the truth was that the gesture softened something inside her that she had not permitted to soften in months. She hated that he could slip beneath her guard with acts of simple practicality. She hated more how much she needed those acts. Their paths crossed again at the market, where she was inspecting fabric remnants to patch a child's coat. Elias joined her without invitation, commenting quietly on the sturdiness of one bolt of wool. His voice was low, gentle, the kind a man used when trying not to startle a frightened bird. She bristled anyway, but before she could snap at him he mentioned that certain goods had been arriving inconsistently at the village, supplies from London delayed or tampered with, which deepened his suspicion that her exile had not ended the schemes surrounding her name. The conversation, stiff and brief, threaded itself with grudging respect. Neither wanted to acknowledge. In the evenings, when the sky burned copper over the sea, she often found herself replaying their exchanges with unsettling clarity. He was a man who carried storms in silence, tightly contained, and yet he moved around her life with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had believed about him. She did not want to care. She certainly did not want to trust him. And still, each day their worlds wove themselves a fraction tighter, as if the village itself had decided that neither exile nor pride would keep them apart. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the horizon like some colossal grey-crested beast, swallowing the last of the day's light as if it meant to erase the village entirely. By the time Isobel noticed the violent shift in the sky, the wind had already begun clawing at her shutters, rattling them so viciously that the hinges screeched. She hurried to secure what she could, the loose corner of the rug, the papers on her table, the small jar of salt that had already tipped once, and had just reached for the iron latch on the back window when a deafening crack split through the cottage. Rain poured through a sudden gap in the roof, splattering onto the floorboards in a cold torrent that soaked her slippers within seconds. Panic clawed at her throat. She dragged a bucket beneath the leak, but it filled almost instantly, water hammering against its tin sides like merciless fingers, wind shoved at the walls. The entire house seemed to tremble. The roof groaned with an ominous creaking that suggested the next gust might tear it open entirely. Alone, shaking, she braced her back against the doorframe and tried to breathe through the rising swell of fear. Exile had taught her how to cope with loneliness, but it had never taught her how to stop a house from collapsing around her. Across the village, Elias had been at the inn, reviewing a stack of tenant accounts by the fire, when the first crack of thunder shook the windows. The storm had come in too quickly, too violently. Any fool could see it was dangerous for anyone living on the cliffside, especially a woman in a fragile cottage built long before the current century. Before the innkeeper could shout a warning about the gale, Elias was already shrugging into his coat, ignoring both the startled cries behind him and the way the wind threatened to rip the door from its hinges the moment he opened it. Rain hit him like cold stones. The path to her cottage, usually a simple climb, had become a treacherous, mud-slick battlefield. He nearly lost his footing twice, but he pushed on, driven by an urgency that burned hotter than the storm's icy claws. By the time he reached her door, the wind was howling like a thing mad with hunger. He hammered on the wood. When she didn't answer, he forced it open. Isobel stood in the center of the room, drenched, battling a tarp she had dragged from the cupboard. Relief and fury collided in his chest. Relief that she was alive, fury that she was trying to fight the storm alone. Together they wrestled the tarp over the gaping section of roof, their hands slipping, their bodies pressed close as the wind roared through every crack it could find. Rain soaked them both as they hauled buckets, shifted furniture, and shoved heavy crates against the shuddering door. At one point Isobel's knees buckled, and Elias caught her, his arms locking around her with a force that left them both breathless. When the worst finally passed and the storm retreated with one last vicious lash against the shutters, they collapsed beside the hearth, water dripping from their hair and clothes, hearts pounding in a shared rhythm of exhaustion and adrenaline. And in the fragile quiet that followed, something unspoken pulsed between them, raw, undeniable, and far more terrifying than the storm itself. Long after the storm had dragged itself back toward the horizon, the cottage remained shuddering softly, as though the walls had absorbed the memory of the wind and could not quite release it. Elias stayed kneeling beside the hearth, his breath still coming in sharp, uneven pulls, watching as Isobel tried to wring the water from her sleeves with trembling fingers. Her hair clung in damp curls around her neck, her cheeks flushed from cold and effort, and something in the quiet determination of her movements struck him harder than any blast of wind had. She reached for another bucket to empty it outside, but when she tried to rise, the lingering shock of the storm made her sway. Before she could protest, Elias caught her elbow, guiding her gently but firmly back onto the small rug near the fire. She looked as though she meant to snap at him, to claw back the tattered remnants of her pride, but the fight flickered and died when her gaze met his. For the first time since her exile, Isobel saw him not as the silent witness to her ruin, nor as an unwelcome shadow trailing her through the village, but as a man stripped of his composure, dripping wet, shaken, and utterly unguarded. They sat that way for a long moment, the only sound the uneven crackling of the fire as it struggled to regain its strength. Elias broke the silence first. He told her that storms on this coast could topple far sturdier roofs than hers, and that no one, certainly not she, ought to face such danger alone. She wanted to argue, to tell him she could have done it alone, that she had done everything alone since the night society cast her out, but the truth she had fought so hard to ignore rose unexpectedly to the surface. She whispered that she had been afraid, the words escaping before she could bury them. It was a confession she had never allowed herself, not in London, not on the long ride north, not in her sleepless nights staring at the dark shape of the rafters. Elias did not answer immediately, but his expression changed, softening, sharpening, aching all at once, as though her vulnerability had cracked something open inside him. He confessed, quietly, that he had been afraid too, not only for her safety in the storm, but from the moment he had witnessed her ruin. He spoke of the helpless rage that had burned in him as Sterling unveiled the forged letter, of the knowledge that stepping forward would only have tightened the noose around her, of the guilt he had carried since for doing too little while she faced the worst alone. His voice trembled, only slightly, but enough that she felt the tremor echo somewhere deep within her. She asked why he had come north, why he had chosen to follow her when society would have forgiven his indifference. He hesitated before answering, then admitted the truth, that he could not endure the thought of her facing the world's cruelty without anyone to stand beside her, and that justice alone had not driven him here. Something more dangerous had, something he had tried to bury under duty and restraint. A fragile warmth unfurled between them, tentative as the first glow of dawn after a storm. The cottage still smelled of damp wood and salt, the windows still rattled with leftover gusts, but for the first time since her exile, Isobel felt the weight on her chest ease, not because the world had grown kinder, but because, in this small pocket of flickering firelight, she was no longer entirely alone. The days after the storm unfolded with deceptive calm, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what shape the aftermath would take. But Blackthorn Bay was a place where nothing remained private for long, and soon every fishmonger, baker, and gossipmonger in the square had woven their version of events, each one more embellished than the last. Some swore they had seen Elias carrying Isobel through the rain as though she were a fainting heroine from a novel. Others declared she had clung to him in terror while the sea tried to claim her, and one imaginative child insisted the wind itself had roared so loudly because it was jealous of the pair. Isobel first heard the whispers on her way to the schoolhouse, the usual cheerful greetings replaced by knowing smiles and sidelong glances. Children tugged at her sleeves asking whether she had truly fought the storm like a pirate queen, while their mothers watched with a mixture of curiosity and cautious sympathy. The attention burned her cheeks, not because of what they implied, though that stung too, but because she knew how quickly compassion could turn to suspicion when a woman lived alone and a man visited her cottage during a gale. Elias, meanwhile, discovered that anonymity was far more fragile than he had hoped. At the inn, men raised brows as he passed, their muttered guesses about the nature of his friendship with the lady up on the cliff growing bolder with each tankard. He remained externally calm, answering questions with the air of a man conducting simple business, but inside he felt the old, familiar tightening of control, a need to guard his composure so fiercely that nothing spilled into view. He told himself he should be angry that the villagers were meddling, but what unsettled him most was not the talk itself, but the way it revealed truths he preferred buried. He had rushed through the storm without hesitation. He had arrived at Isobel's door, terrified of the worst, and he did find himself thinking of her more often than was wise, for a man trained to keep every feeling leashed. For Isobel, the gossip rekindled the fear she thought she had finally begun to master. She had worked tirelessly to rebuild a fragile sense of belonging in Blackthorn Bay, and now, in a handful of careless rumors, she felt the ground shift again, just enough to remind her that reputation was a treacherous beast, quick to turn and bite. Once, she would have retreated into silence, bowed her head, allowed the world to write its story over her, but exile had stripped her too raw and shown her too much to ever shrink easily again. Even so, she walked the village with her chin lifted and her spine straight, refusing to grant anyone the pleasure of seeing her rattled. Elias saw her resolve, admired it, and yet allowed the whispers to spread just enough to serve a purpose. If Sterling was indeed watching from London, if the men behind the forged letter still believed Isobel could influence his holdings, then gossip linking them, even inaccurately, might coax them into revealing themselves. It was a cruel calculation, one that tasted bitter the moment he made it. But he told himself that protecting her required more than comfort and kindness. It required drawing their unseen enemy out of the shadows, even at the cost of her temporary unease. He hated the necessity. He hated the way her eyes seemed a little more guarded each time they met. But he accepted it all the same, not realizing yet that every inch they drifted closer or farther was another thread, tightening the bond that neither of them had chosen and neither could now avoid. It happened on a deceptively clear morning, the sort of crisp, sunlit day that made Blackthorn Bay look almost gentle, the salt air sharp, but not cruel. Isobel was returning from the schoolhouse with a small bundle of borrowed books when she saw the carriage, sleek, black, polished to a London shine, coming up the muddy village road like a visiting monarch, insisting the world rearrange itself in welcome. The horses were too fine for this remote corner of the coast, their tack silvered, their breath puffing in elegant clouds. Mrs. Penwick murmured something sharp under her breath, as though sensing trouble, and excused herself with unusual haste. Isobel felt her stomach twist, a subtle, heavy dread she could not yet name. When the carriage stopped and the door swung open, dread solidified into cold certainty. Lord Sterling stepped down with the grace of a man alighting from a ballroom dais, rather than a country road still slick from last night's rain. His smile was warm, polished, utterly false, a hand-painted veneer she recognized all too well. "My dear cousin," he said, as though greeting her on a pleasant promenade rather than the place to which he himself had orchestrated her banishment. "How pale you look. Blackthorn Bay clearly has not agreed with you. Still, I assumed it was time someone from the family checked on your circumstances." He offered a gloved hand, which she ignored, her spine straightening with controlled dignity. He carried a parcel of fine chocolates in one hand and a neat folder of papers in the other, both gifts with fangs hidden in their ribboned bows. He began walking beside her with an air of casual authority, remarking on the quaintness of the village, the crudeness of local manners, and the regrettable necessity of her exile, always speaking in a tone pitched loud enough for the watching villagers to hear. His words drifted like poison into the morning air. Isobel managed to keep her expression cool, But inside her pulse raced. She asked, in a voice steady as polished steel, why he had travelled so far merely to deliver confections and condolences. Sterling's smile did not falter. Instead, he presented the folder, documents requiring her signature, he claimed, to ease the legal burdens caused by her unfortunate situation. He glossed over the specifics with airy vagueness, but she caught certain words: transfer, relinquish, trusteeship, words that screamed warning. Before she could challenge him, Elias appeared, quiet, composed, entirely unexpected, approaching with that steady, contained intensity that made the villagers stand a little straighter without fully knowing why. Sterling's eyes flickered, the briefest sign of recognition he quickly buried beneath affected ignorance. Elias greeted them with the politeness of a stranger and was introduced as a local agent assisting with coastal properties. Isobel watched the exchange with narrowed eyes while the two men studied one another like duelists assessing the reach of a blade. Sterling's charm turned brittle, Elias's calm turned colder. Something sharp and silent passed between them, a recognition of mutual threat. For the rest of the morning, Sterling played the affectionate cousin, flattering the villagers, praising Isobel's fortitude, hinting that her exile might soon be resolved if she proved cooperative. Beneath every word lay pressure, coercion, warning. When he finally departed, leaving her with the chocolates and the sheaf of papers, the sunlight seemed colder than before. She held the folder in trembling hands, knowing instinctively that this was no gift. It was a summons, a trap, and the first real glimpse of the enemy who had orchestrated the ruin of her name. Isobel waited until Sterling's carriage had rolled completely out of sight before she allowed herself to breathe again, each inhale shallow and taut, as though taking too much air might somehow summon him back. The folder he had pressed into her hands felt heavier than any physical weight, a quiet threat wrapped in paper and sealed with familial poison. She carried it to her cottage with deliberate calm, refusing to let her fingers tremble where villagers might see. Only once the door closed behind her did she sag against it for a moment, gathering the resolve she had learned to cultivate in exile like a second, sturdier skin. When she laid the documents on the table, the neatness of Sterling's handwriting struck her as mocking, smooth, elegant strokes arranging her fate with the ease of a man signing invitations to dinner. She opened the first page and immediately felt her stomach twist. The clauses were dense, littered with legal phrasing, designed to lull the inattentive into compliance. Yet even at a glance she recognized enough familiar terms to understand the truth. He meant to strip her of influence over her dowry lands, reroute certain rights through trustees suspiciously aligned with his interests, and cement arrangements that would weaken not only the Fairfax line, but certain northern boundaries tied to the Ashbourne estates as well. This had never been about shame. It had always been about power. When Elias arrived, having clearly witnessed enough of Sterling's visit to sense danger, Isobel almost resented the relief she felt at the sound of his knock. He stepped inside without ceremony, his expression controlled, but his gaze sharpened the instant it landed on the papers splayed across her table. She explained what little she understood, her voice taut with anger she refused to admit was fear. Elias listened with the quiet intensity of a man who heard far more than was spoken. Then, with her permission, he moved beside her at the table and began examining the documents. His eyes flicked rapidly from clause to clause, his jaw working once, twice, before he exhaled slowly. He told her, in a low voice edged with fury, that these terms would not only sever her from future inheritance, but grant Sterling strategic rights that could compromise land adjoining his northern holdings. He added, almost as an afterthought, that signing would place her entirely under the mercy of men who had already proven they would use her as a pawn without hesitation. The room felt smaller as the truth settled between them. Isobel felt heat rising beneath her ribs, not shame this time, but something fiercer. Sterling expected her to fold neatly into the shape he required, the way she always had in London under her mother's critical gaze. But Exile had carved something new into her, something she had not yet dared name. She lifted her chin, closed the folder and said with quiet steadiness that she would not sign anything without understanding every word. Elias's eyes met hers, surprise flickering there, not because he doubted her intelligence, but because she was no longer asking to be guided, only to be armed. When Sterling returned the next morning expecting her meek compliance, he found a very different scene. Isobel stood beside Elias, the folder closed but not surrendered, her expression composed and unmovable. Elias greeted Sterling with polite coolness, stating he would assist in reviewing the legal complexities as a matter of local concern. Sterling's smile thinned to a blade. Lines had been drawn with quiet finality. The war he had begun would no longer be fought in shadows. The cottage transformed over the next week into a place of quiet, relentless study, its small wooden table buried beneath papers, ink pots, and the faintly herbal scent of Mrs. Penwick's headache tea that Isobel had begun brewing by necessity. Each evening after her lessons at the schoolhouse, she returned home to find Elias already seated at the table, never announcing his arrival, never assuming welcome, simply waiting with an air of composed purpose that made it impossible to send him away. They worked by lamplight, their shadows swaying across the plaster walls as though they, too, bent over the documents with furrowed brows. Elias explained the hidden traps within legal phrases, the meaning behind, for convenience, the sharp bite concealed in temporary trusteeship, the way a single line could transfer power so completely that the victim never realized what had been taken until nothing remained. Isobel listened with fierce concentration, her fingers moving deftly across each line as she learned to dismantle the elegant weapons her cousin had placed before her. At first she felt the old instincts tugging, polite deference, quiet agreement, the reflex to let a man's voice guide over her own, but Elias's patience stripped those habits away. He encouraged her questions, challenged her hesitations, pushed her to read between lines rather than simply through them. The more she learned, the more her initial anger crystallized into something sharper, resolve. One night, as rain pattered softly against the window, Isobel caught him watching her, not with pity, not with overbearing protectiveness, but with something like pride. It unsettled her as much as it warmed her, dragging her pulse into an unsteady rhythm she pretended not to notice. She asked him why he was helping her with such devotion, why he had chosen to involve himself when the scandal could just as easily have been left to rot quietly at the edge of England. His answer came slowly, as if he had sorted through several truths before selecting the safest one, because those who orchestrated the scheme believed her weak, and he refused to let their belief become true. She wanted to ask what the unsaid truths were, the ones reflected in the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the way his presence steadied the air in the room, but she bit down on the question. Some things were easier left unspoken. The lessons grew more complex. Soon she was not only absorbing information, but challenging Elias directly, pointing out contradictions, suggesting amendments, identifying the subtle ways Sterling had crafted each clause to bind her legally and morally. Each time she uncovered a detail he had overlooked, his lips curved in a rare, fleeting smile that sent a disconcerting warmth through her. The tension between them shifted, once brittle and defensive, now threaded with reluctant admiration and an intimacy built not on stolen glances or whispered flirtations, but on shared battle lines inked across paper. By the end of the week, Isobel could read the entire sheaf of documents aloud, without faltering, dissecting each phrase with a precision that astonished even herself. Exile had not diminished her. It had sharpened her into a woman capable of defending her own future, and Elias knew, felt in his bones, that Sterling had grossly underestimated the girl he had tried to bury. As she closed the final page one evening and declared, "He will not win," Elias believed her. Not because he would stand beside her, though he would, but because she was learning how to stand without him. By the time the village festival arrived, a modest affair of lanterns strung between crooked cottages, fiddlers tuning their instruments beside crates and barrels, children darting beneath strings of paper ribbons, Isobel felt a rare sense of lightness humming beneath her ribs. For weeks she had been braced for conflict, for Sterling's return, for Elias's grim warnings to manifest into something worse. But on this evening the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and wood smoke, and for once the weight pressing on her chest eased just enough for her to breathe without restraint. She wore her plainest dress, but she had mended it carefully the night before, and the village women greeted her with warm smiles, insisting she join the games and share the sugared pastries cooling on wooden tables. Children tugged at her hands, proud to show her paper lanterns painted with crooked boats and improbable sea monsters. It was the first time since her exile that she felt something close to belonging, fragile, tentative, but real. Elias arrived later, his presence almost incongruous against the riot of color and noise, dressed in his usual dark coat but with a faint uncertainty in his step, as though he were unused to being invited rather than expected. He lingered at the festival's edge, observing the crowd with the wary calm of a man who had spent too long in rooms where every conversation concealed an agenda. But his gaze softened when it found her across the lantern-lit square. For a long moment, neither approached, as though the distance between them held its own fragile balance. Then the fiddlers struck up a lively reel, and the villagers began forming pairs in the center of the square. Before Isobel could retreat into the comforting anonymity of her own shadow, Elias crossed the space between them with quiet purpose and extended his hand. "Will you dance with me?" The question startled her, not because he asked, but because of the gentleness in his voice. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his, and the warmth of his grip unsettled her in ways she refused to name. They joined the dance, moving through steps that were less refined than the waltzes of London ballrooms, yet far more alive. Elias adapted quickly, his natural grace smoothing the rough edges of the folk dance until it felt almost elegant. Laughter bubbled from Isobel, surprised and unguarded, and the sound drew a quiet, rare smile from him. They spun past lanterns glowing gold and orange, their shadows mingling on the packed earth as though they had been dancing together for years instead of minutes. When the music slowed and the square shifted into a quieter hush, they found themselves walking side by side toward the cliff's edge, drawn by an unspoken need for air. The sea below reflected the lantern light in fractured glimmers. Elias spoke first, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He told her he had once thought, long before the scandal, that he might have wished to know her better, that he had noticed her in rooms where she felt invisible. The confession hovered between them, tender and dangerous. Isobel's pulse stumbled. For a moment she thought he might say more, something that would shatter whatever fragile boundary kept them aligned yet apart. But then he hesitated, jaw tightening as though wrestling with himself, and the moment passed like a candle snuffed by the wind, leaving behind a warmth that should not have been possible in the cool night air. Isobel woke the next morning with the faint echoes of lantern light still lingering in her mind, the memory of dancing with Elias drifting through her thoughts like the afterglow of a dream she knew she should not examine too closely. She tried to bury the sensation beneath her usual morning routine, tidying the cottage, preparing her lessons, sweeping the lingering scent of festival smoke from her clothes. But the feeling followed her like a soft warmth she could neither name nor justify. She was halfway through washing the breakfast dishes when the unmistakable crunch of carriage wheels on gravel reached her ears. Not the service carts of the village, nor the lumbering wagon that delivered coal every fortnight. This sound was crisp, refined, expensive. A breath lodged in her throat. No one from London visited without purpose, and every purpose carried danger. She stepped outside just as a gleaming grey carriage rolled to a halt before her cottage, silver accents glinting like small, mocking stars. Her mother descended first, her posture rigid, her chin lifted in the familiar angle of genteel disapproval. Behind her stepped Marianne, Isobel's younger sister, dressed in a gown so fine it seemed almost ostentatious against the bleak coastal backdrop. Both women regarded the cottage as if they had stumbled upon a ruin rather than their own kin's dwelling. Marianne's expression flickered between pity and superiority, the way it always had when the sisters had been paraded through society's gauntlet of judgment. But her mother's gaze held something far worse than judgment, containment, as if she feared the cottage itself might stain her reputation through proximity. "Isobel," Lady Fairfax said, her voice tight, "you look unwell." It was not a question nor a kindness, merely an observation sharpened into a blade. She swept into the cottage uninvited, glancing around with the pinched dismay of a woman forced to acknowledge the existence of hardship she had never known. Marianne followed, touching a chipped teacup, with the same caution one might use when handling a dead mouse. They wasted no time before launching into the true purpose of their visit. Sterling, they informed her, had expressed grave concerns about her recent behavior. Rumors had reached London, ugly rumors, implying she was entangling herself with a man of dubious background while also refusing legal cooperation. Her mother's tone grew clipped as she spoke of these whispers, as though Isobel herself had conjured them from thin air rather than having them weaponized against her. They urged her to sign Sterling's documents at once, to stop making matters worse for the family, to cease her reckless stubbornness. Every word stripped flesh from bone. Marianne watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, as if unsure whether Isobel were the villain or the victim. Isobel listened, her heartbeat steadying into something cold and resolute. She had spent her entire life bending beneath these very voices, voices that softened when convenient and hardened when useful. Exile had taught her to hear them differently, to recognize their demands not as guidance, but as control dressed in velvet. When she finally spoke, it was with a calm she did not know she possessed. She told them she would not sign anything she did not understand. Her mother stiffened, color rising in her cheeks. "You owe us obedience," she hissed. But Isobel no longer believed she owed them anything at all. Lady Fairfax stared at her eldest daughter as though Isobel had spoken a foreign language, something uncouth, unthinkable, impossible for a well-bred girl to possess. Defiance. Real, calm, unwavering defiance. For a moment, the cottage felt too small to hold the four of them: Isobel, her mother, Marianne, and the ghost of every expectation she had ever failed simply by existing as herself. "Obedience is not optional," her mother continued, her voice fraying at the edges as though Isobel's refusal had tugged at a thread she could not afford to let unravel. "You brought shame upon us. You brought shame upon Marianne. You owe this family whatever it takes to mend what you shattered." Marianne flinched at the mention of her name, her gaze darting nervously between them, as though unsure whom she should fear displeasing most. Isobel did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She merely straightened, folding her hands in front of her in a gesture that looked deceptively gentle. Inside, something long dormant, perhaps suffocated since childhood, rose with startling clarity. Her mother continued berating her, switching between wounded outrage and brittle pleading, insisting that Isobel must sign the papers to restore their standing, that she must stop bringing humiliation upon the Fairfax name, that she must think of her sister's prospects, her father's position, her mother's social circle. Every justification served the same end: Isobel's compliance, her erasure, her silence. The moment stretched until it felt like a blade pressed against her throat. Isobel reached slowly for the folder resting on the table, her mother's gaze brightening with victory. But instead of opening it, Isobel held the papers lightly, almost tenderly, as though weighing every word inside. Then, with one decisive motion, she tore the entire sheaf cleanly, neatly, deliberately down the middle. The sound sliced through the room like the crack of a pistol. Marianne gasped, a small, strangled sound of disbelief. Her mother's face drained of color, then flooded with it again in a violent rush, horror twisting her features into something almost unrecognizable. You foolish girl," Lady Fairfax choked. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Isobel replied, her voice soft and steady. "For the first time in my life, I do." Her mother sputtered, pacing, hands shaking as she tried to gather the ruined pages, as though taping them back together might also repair the control she had lost. Marianne reached for Isobel in timid confusion, whispering that she should apologize, that she should fix this before everything got worse. But Isobel had lived in the "before everything gets worse" for her entire life. She had bent and bowed and yielded until there was nothing left of her but a shadow shaped by other people's fears. She stepped back from them both, breathing deeply as something fierce and liberating unfurled in her chest. "I will not be handled like property," she said. "Not by Sterling, not by father, not by you." Her mother's fury shattered into cold, trembling silence. The door opened then, Elias standing on the threshold, having arrived mid-commotion. He took in the torn documents, the pale fury on Lady Fairfax's face, the steel in Isobel's posture. For a heartbeat he said nothing. Then something like awe flickered across his features, because Exile had not broken her after all. It had woken her. The moment her mother's carriage rattled away from the cottage, carrying indignation, shredded documents, and the last shreds of the obedience Isobel had once owed, silence settled like ash over the room. It clung to her skin, to the wooden beams, to the faint scent of salt drifting through the cracked shutters. But it did not feel empty. It felt cleansing. Elias remained only long enough to ensure she was steady, his expression taut with a fury he kept tightly harnessed beneath civility, then left with a promise to return once he had spoken to his solicitor. Isobel listened to the fading echo of his boots, the quiet final click of the gate, and allowed herself one trembling breath before she straightened her shoulders and prepared, finally, to claim her day. Yet fate, or perhaps the cruelty of those who feared her refusal, had never intended to leave her peace for long. By the next afternoon the consequences arrived, swift and merciless, as if summoned by her single act of defiance. Mrs. Kersey, the landlady who had always treated Isobel with brisk neutrality, arrived with downcast eyes and uncharacteristic hesitation. She explained, in halting tones, that word had come from London. Isobel's small allowance, the meager quarterly sum that had kept food on her table and fire in her hearth, had been temporarily suspended. The phrasing was vague enough to be polite and sharp enough to cut. Her father had withdrawn the funds, citing necessary fiscal restraint, but Isobel heard the truth beneath the gentility: punishment, reprisal. retaliation for daring to rip apart Sterling's carefully laid snares. As Mrs. Kersey muttered apologies and shuffled nervously away, Isobel stood very still, her mind steady in a way it had never been in London. Once, such a blow would have sent her spiraling into shame and helplessness. Now, it sparked something cold and bright within her, a recognition that she had severed herself from her family's control, and they had responded like tyrants losing their favorite prisoner. But more followed. By evening, the butcher who had always greeted her with a smile claimed his accounts were unfortunately full this month and could not extend credit. The cooper refused to repair her water barrel despite having promised to just days earlier. Two mothers withdrew their children from her lessons, citing uncertainty about her reputation, and when she passed Mrs. Penwick's cottage on her return home, she caught frantic whispers of rumors already slithering through the village, rumors that she was manipulating a mysterious gentleman for illicit support, that she planned to entangle the village in schemes of inheritance, that the Duke of Ashbourne himself had been compromised in some unnamed financial scandal involving her exile. They were absurd. They were calculated. They were unmistakably Sterling's doing. Isobel walked home through the dimming light, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Each whispered slight, each closed door, each careful avoidance by people she had worked so hard to help, pressed against her like old ghosts of humiliation. She felt the echoes of who she once was, a girl shaped by fear of judgment, try to claw their way up from the past. But she refused to yield. Standing in the doorway of her cottage, she forced her breath into a steady rhythm and whispered aloud, "I will not let them bury me again." Just then, the faint crunch of footsteps approached. Elias emerged from the dusk, his expression carved in quiet fury, his coat damp from the sea wind. He paused when he saw her standing alone in the fading light, her face lit with anger rather than despair. Something softened in his gaze, a warmth she almost could not bear to face. "They've cut your funds," he said, voice low, "and they've poisoned the village against you." Isobel lifted her chin, feeling strength coil through her like steel. "Then we fight," she replied, and for the first time, she felt the words as truth, her truth, not borrowed or forced or whispered through tears. The next morning dawned grey and brittle, as if the sky itself were bracing for whatever blow might come next, but Isobel awoke with a steadiness she had not felt in years, not the brittle composure of a dutiful daughter, but the grounded strength of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for her own existence. She dressed with deliberate simplicity, fastening her worn cloak around her shoulders as though buttoning armor into place, and stepped into the chill air with a clarity of purpose forged from the night's quiet resolve. If her family had cut off her allowance, then she would earn her keep. If the village doubted her, she would show them her worth. And if Sterling hoped to frighten her back into submission, then he had misjudged the girl he cast into exile. She walked directly to the schoolhouse, ignoring the whispers that fluttered behind her, like scraps of torn paper caught in the wind. Mrs. Penwick greeted her with a tight, reluctant smile, an apology hidden behind the teacher's habitual caution, and admitted that some parents had grown uneasy. Isobel thanked her gently, then offered to help in any way she still could. Over the next days, she carved out work where society had once denied her any purpose. She began tutoring several children whose families could not afford lessons, receiving small payments in the form of bread, candles, and extra blankets. At first, she felt the sharp sting of humiliation at such barter, shame conditioned into her bones by years of aristocratic training, but as she knelt beside children practicing their letters, watching their faces brighten with each small triumph, she realized the work fed something in her that no London ballroom ever had. Soon she was not only teaching, she was helping fishermen's wives tally accounts, teaching them how to read contracts, showing them where merchants in the next village had been charging unfair prices. Word spread quickly that Lady Isobel Fairfax, fallen, ruined, banished, had a mind sharp enough to untangle numbers and a patience that soothed even the most anxious child. Women who once whispered now knocked hesitantly at her door, asking whether she had a moment to explain this ledger, or that debt, or how to write a letter to a son at sea. Meanwhile, Elias watched all of this from the edges of her expanding orbit, sometimes openly, sometimes from a distance, though he attempted to hide his admiration behind the veneer of a man merely fulfilling his duty. He spoke with fishermen about their winter stores, arranged for repairs to be made to the schoolhouse roof without ever taking credit, and quietly countered the worst rumors before they could take root. Yet it was Isobel who transformed the village's perception of her, not with grand gestures, but through steady work and unvarnished sincerity. Each evening she returned to her cottage exhausted, chilled to the bone, but lighter somehow, as though the efforts of the day stripped away some of the lingering shame she had carried from London. One evening, as she finished sorting a bundle of arithmetic papers by candlelight, a soft knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Elias stood there, the sea wind ruffling his hair, a look of quiet astonishment in his eyes. "You've rebuilt what they tried to destroy," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Not through money, through sheer will." Isobel felt something warm and dangerous bloom beneath her ribs. "I'm simply earning my place," she whispered. But Elias shook his head, gaze steady. "No," he murmured. "You're claiming it." The days that followed seemed almost gentle compared to the storms, emotional and otherwise, that had battered her since arriving in Blackthorn Bay. The village children, still timid around the cliffs after the last tempest, had begun collecting shells again for their lessons in natural history, and Isobel gladly accompanied them on the narrow paths overlooking the restless sea. She kept a careful eye on each child, her heart tightening whenever they strayed too near the edge, but there was something calming in the routine of their curious voices and tiny, excited hands thrusting treasures into her palms. For a brief stretch of days, life felt almost normal, if normal could exist for a woman carving a new identity from the ruins of her old one. But normalcy, she was learning, was fragile as blown glass. It took only a single misstep to shatter it. The afternoon sunlight was bright but cold, reflecting off the slick stones as the tide crept inward. A boy named Jonah, barely 8, eager to impress, darted toward a cluster of shells perched on a ledge dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Isobel called out to him, her voice sharp with warning, but he either did not hear or did not heed her. He slipped. She lunged without thinking, grabbing his coat just as his foot skidded across wet rock. For an instant the world tilted, the sky and sea trading places, and she felt the sickening pull of gravity yanking both of them toward the jagged drop below. Jonah cried out. She gripped him tighter, her boots sliding, her breath gone. The cliff edge crumbled beneath her heel, pebbles scattering like tiny warnings into the roaring void. And then, hands, strong, unyielding, tearing both of them back from the brink with a force that jolted through her spine. Elias. Somehow he had reached them in time. She collapsed against him in a shaking heap, Jonah already scrambling to safety with wide, terrified eyes. But Isobel could not move, not with the echo of the near fall still crashing through her veins. She felt Elias's arms locked around her, the tension in his muscles trembling with the aftermath of panic he rarely allowed anyone to see. For a heartbeat he held her too tightly, but she did not pull away, not yet, not while her heart still thundered against her ribs in unsteady terror. But then the moment shifted. The terror that had clung to both of them melted into something hot and uncontrollable. Elias pulled back just enough to frame her face in his hands, his breath ragged, his eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness that unsettled her to the core. And before reason could steady either of them, he kissed her, hard, desperate, the kind of kiss a man gives when he has nearly lost something he never admitted he wanted. The world narrowed to the anchor of his hands, the heat of his mouth, the shudder she felt in him, as though he fought an emotion too large to contain. And, God help her, she kissed him back, without hesitation, without thought, as if the very air between them demanded it. Then clarity slammed into her like a second cliff. She ripped herself away, breathless, horrified by how completely she had yielded. "We cannot," she whispered, voice shaking. "We cannot do this." Elias stood stunned, fighting for composure, every line of him taut with conflict. Jonah watched them from a distance, his small face pale with confusion. Isobel turned away, forcing her breath into something steady, something functional, something that would allow her to put one step in front of the other. Elias reached out as if to speak, but she moved too quickly, gathering the children and ushering them down the path with trembling authority. The walk back to the village was long, silent, and heavy with the knowledge that a line had been crossed, one neither of them knew how to erase. For 3 days after the kiss, the village seemed to hold its breath, as though even the sea sensed the fragile fracture running between them and dared not disturb it. Isobel moved through her routines with rigid precision, her steps measured, her voice calm, her eyes never lingering on any place where Elias might appear. She taught her lessons, sorted her ledgers, patched children's coats, all with a quiet ferocity that made it impossible for anyone to question her composure. But inside, her thoughts churned like a tide at war with itself. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt again the terrifying drop of the cliff, the desperate grip of Elias's arms around her, the heat of his mouth, the shudder that had passed through his body as though the world had narrowed to the single moment he might have lost her. And worse, far worse, she remembered how quickly she had broken beneath it, how naturally she had yielded to him, as if the exile, the ruin, the shame, all of it had merely been waiting for this one reckless spark. She could not afford such weakness. She could not afford to want anything from him. Wanting had destroyed her once already. Elias, for his part, found the days intolerable. He tried to tell himself he had regained control, that his composure was firmly reassembled, that the kiss had been a moment of panic, not confession. But the guilt gnawed at him with every passing hour. Each time he approached the schoolhouse to check on her, she turned away before he reached the door. When he walked the cliff path at dusk, she had already left. At the market, she greeted him with a polite curtsy so cool and distant, he felt the chill long after she'd passed. The villagers, of course, noticed. Curious eyes followed the space between them like a story unfolding in real time. Their silence crackled with unspoken questions. Some murmured that perhaps Lady Fairfax had grown wiser than to entangle herself with a man of mystery. Others whispered that Mr. Raven, whoever he truly was, had thought too highly of his charms and overstepped. And all the while Sterling's rumors continued sliding through the village like oil on water, seeping inevitably into the cracks left by that single, forbidden moment. Elias tried to bury himself in work, speaking with innkeepers, examining coastal boundaries, writing letters that revealed nothing but asked far too much of his solicitor. But each night he found himself standing outside Isobel's cottage, without meaning to, staring at the faint glow of her window like a man haunted by a truth he had no words for. He ached to speak to her, to explain, to apologize, but he knew any attempt would only further endanger her reputation, already teetering under the weight of village suspicion, so he stayed silent, letting the distance act as a penance he despised. Isobel told herself she welcomed the quiet. She told herself she was relieved not to feel his gaze tracing the edges of her thoughts. She told herself she was stronger for having shut him out. But each night, lying in the narrow bed with the roar of the sea pressing against the shutters, she felt the hollow ache of something left undone, something too dangerous to name. By the end of the week, the space between them had hardened into a wall neither dared touch, and Lord Sterling, watching from afar with predatory satisfaction, recognized the fracture for exactly what it was, the perfect fault line to exploit. The fracture between Isobel and Elias had barely settled into its aching silence when the next blow landed, quietly at first, as most dangers did in Blackthorn Bay. It began with a whisper traded between two fishermen at dawn, carried by the wind to the market square, then passed from tongue to tongue with the insidious ease of smoke slipping beneath a door. Isobel heard the first hint of it when Mrs. Brigham, usually warm and eager for conversation, paused mid-greeting and looked away too quickly, murmuring something about unsettled times. Later, Mr. Tiller avoided her entirely, pretending fascination with an empty bucket rather than meeting her gaze. Children who once ran to her with eager questions now hovered uncertainly at a distance, glancing nervously toward the adults before daring to approach. The shift was small yet unmistakable, a subtle withdrawal that clawed at her heart with the same cold dread she had known in London. Something was wrong, something had been set in motion, and she already suspected the name attached to it. The truth came in pieces, each one more jagged than the last. A neighbor's wife, too kind-hearted to maintain silent avoidance for long, finally confessed in a hushed voice that certain people believed Isobel had been persuading Mr. Raven to favor specific families with financial allowances and reduced rents, that she had been influencing decisions about village repairs, that she was using her supposed closeness to him as leverage, that she had entangled him, whether willingly or by manipulation, in proposals that served her rather than the community. And the worst rumor of all, that Elias was secretly financing her livelihood, sustaining her cottage, papers, goods, and lessons all through unnamed accounts and quiet transactions. The implication hung heavily in every whispered phrase. Fallen women, after all, only had so many ways to survive. The words hit Isobel like a blow to the chest. She tried to respond with dignity, insisting such claims were false, but each denial only tightened the doubt in the listener's eyes. Rumors cared nothing for truth. They fed on silence, on uncertainty, on every brittle piece of distance between her and Elias, and that distance, carefully cultivated as protection, now became the weapon used to cut her down. She felt the walls of her hard-earned place in the village tilt dangerously, the foundation she had built shifting beneath her feet. Mrs. Penwick, eyes full of reluctant pity, confessed later that some parents were reconsidering whether their children should continue lessons with her until matters clarified. It was London again. Different walls, different accents, same cruel shadows. Elias discovered the situation when he entered the inn, and conversation snapped shut, like a book slammed shut mid-sentence. He questioned the innkeeper, who only hemmed and hawed before admitting the rumors were everywhere now, that Sterling's presence in the village had started tongues wagging, and that perhaps Mr. Raven should keep a respectful distance before things worsened. Elias left the inn with his jaw clenched, fury burning so cold it made him dizzy. He knew at once that Sterling had engineered this, that the man had found a seam in their defenses and driven a wedge through it. Yet the worst moment came that evening, when Elias approached Isobel on the empty shoreline, the sky bruised with approaching dusk. She did not look up at first, she simply held her shawl tighter, staring at the waves with a quiet devastation that struck him deeper than any harsh word could. When she finally turned, her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "It appears I destroy everything I touch," she murmured, the words stripped of bitterness and left only with grief, "including you." Elias took a step forward, the instinct to reach for her almost overpowering. But the distance she held, fragile, shaking, deliberate, stopped him, because for the first time, she did not fear him. She feared herself. By the next morning, Blackthorn Bay buzzed like a disturbed hive, thick with speculation and suspicion, and Elias understood, finally, completely, that staying silent was no longer caution, but surrender. Sterling had turned the village against Isobel with surgical precision, poisoning every glance, every whispered remark, every moment of hesitation. And if Elias allowed this lie to grow even a little longer, it would take root so deeply that no truth could ever uproot it. So he did the most uncharacteristic thing he had done in his adult life. He chose spectacle. Not shadows, not quiet investigation, not controlled subtlety. A public declaration, a risk, a reckoning. Market day dawned bright and cold, the square already crowded with villagers bartering smoked fish and winter herbs. Elias walked straight into the center, past the stalls and wagons, ignoring the murmured greetings that faltered as eyes followed his deliberate stride. He climbed the low stone step beside the communal well, the closest thing Blackthorn Bay had to a podium, and waited until the murmuring swelled into a hush. Faces tilted up like flowers turning towards sun, curiosity sharp and wary. For a moment, the only sound was the gulls overhead, crying as though urging him onward. "My name," he said, his voice cutting through the cold air with steady force, "is Elias Ravenscroft." A ripple shot through the crowd. Gasps, startled whispers, disbelief blooming like wildfire. Everyone knew the name. Every villager who had ever sent a tax petition or heard rumors of noble families recognized it instantly. A duke. The duke. The quiet, courteous stranger, whom they had assumed a modest agent or rent collector, was, in truth, one of the most powerful men in the realm. Elias let the shock settle like dust on stone before he spoke again. "I wish to address the rumors concerning Lady Isobel Fairfax." His tone did not waver. "They are false, all of them." He went on, not with elaborate speeches or dramatic protestations, but with precise, unyielding truth. He told them that Lady Fairfax had neither requested nor received any financial manipulation, that she had not interfered in village matters, that she had not sought advantage, nor employed him for her gain. He stated, calmly, clearly, that her work with the children, her help with the ledgers, and her contributions to the community were done wholly of her own integrity. He called her honorable, capable, trustworthy, and he made sure every villager heard it. A hush fell over the square, not the hush of gossip but of re-evaluation. People glanced at one another, at the ground, at the edges of their own behavior. The butcher's wife wiped her hands on her apron in awkward guilt. The cooper shifted uneasily. Even Mrs. Brigham's sharp features softened. Some part of them already knew they had wronged her. Now they knew they had done so in full view of a duke's condemnation. Elias took a breath that trembled only once. "Any who question her good name," he finished, "should answer to me." It was not a threat barked in arrogance. It was a vow, quiet, controlled, absolute. From the edge of the crowd, Isobel stood frozen, a basket of apples clutched against her chest, her breath caught between disbelief and something deeper, warmer, more shattering. Elias had undone his own anonymity, his careful distance, his protective caution for her sake, for her truth, for her dignity. and for the first time since her exile began, she felt society held no claim over her heart, because someone had finally refused to let the world choose her worth. The moment Elias stepped down from the well's stone ledge, the village exhaled. Not with relief. Relief would require understanding, and they were only beginning to see how much they had misunderstood, but with a collective recalibration, like a compass needle finally recognizing true north after spinning wildly. People parted for him as he crossed the square, their expressions ranging from awe to sheepish gratitude, to embarrassed apology. But Elias did not look at them. His gaze sought only one person. Isobel stood near the edge of the crowd, her basket of apples forgotten at her feet, her face pale with shock, yet flushed with something he could not name. He approached slowly, carefully, as though nearing a wild creature who might bolt at the slightest wrong movement. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the square fading into a muted hum around them. But dignity, and pride sharpened by months of hurt, held Isobel still. She did not flee. She did not collapse. She did not throw herself into his arms, though the tremor in her breath betrayed how close she was to breaking. Instead, she lifted her chin in that quiet, determined way of hers and asked, "Why did you reveal yourself?" Her voice was soft, but its steadiness was a shield she gripped with both hands. "Because truth means nothing when whispered," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But spoken aloud, it becomes armor." She swallowed hard, eyes glinting with the remnants of old wounds. "You risked your reputation," she whispered, "your influence, everything. And you risked your life on that cliff," he countered, the barest edge of pain in his words. "Everything I revealed today was mine to choose. What you have suffered was not." The villagers began offering greetings then, breaking the fragile bubble surrounding them. Some approached Isobel with shy apologies. Others offered her small tokens, a spool of thread, a jar of honey, a promise to send their children back to lessons. She accepted each gesture with grace, though her hands trembled beneath the weight of it all. Elias stepped back, allowing her space, watching the way she navigated this shifting tide of sympathy with a composure earned through fire. But as the crowd thinned, Mrs. Penwick approached with urgency in her stride and worry clouding her eyes. "My lady," she said, voice pitched low, "there is something you must know. Lord Stirling is expected to return within days. Word is he plans to summon you back to London for a formal inquiry." She hesitated before adding, "Some say he means to accuse you publicly now that the private approach has failed." The world tilted, not in the dizzying, heart-stealing way of the cliff's edge, but in the sickening, familiar way of London's judgment, rising like a noose around her throat. Inquiry, accusation, public ruin, again. Isobel gripped the handle of her basket as if anchoring herself. "I will not return," she murmured, but the words trembled under the weight of what she already knew. Refusal meant consequences far larger than gossip. Elias stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him even without touching. "Then you will not face him alone," he said, voice quiet but carved in iron. She turned to him, eyes searching his, questioning the vow he did not hesitate to make. "This is not your fight," she whispered. "It became mine the moment they used you to reach me," he replied. And long before that, if I am honest, the admission struck deeper than any gesture he had made in the square. For the first time, she wondered, not with fear, but with dangerous hope, whether she was no longer fighting merely for survival, but fighting for the life she had never been allowed to imagine. Stirling returned 2 days later, but he did not arrive with chocolates or a velvet smile this time. No, this time he came with the cold arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. His carriage appeared at the crest of the hill like a storm cloud, black and gleaming, flanked by 2 mounted guards paid handsomely for loyalty rather than righteousness. The horses' hooves struck the ground with sharp, deliberate rhythm, sending villagers scurrying into doorways as if the devil himself had crested the ridge. Stirling stepped down onto the muddy road without waiting for assistance, his expression a mask of controlled disdain as he surveyed the village that had not bowed as easily as he expected. His gaze settled on Isobel's cottage before sweeping toward the gathering cluster of villagers, toward Elias, who stood at the front of the small crowd like a wall carved from stone. "Your Grace," Stirling said with a shallow bow, each syllable dripping with mock politeness, "I must admit, when I heard you had embedded yourself in this coastal gutter, under false pretenses, no less, I thought it merely a tiresome rumor. But here you are, a duke playing landlord's clerk." His smile sharpened. How quaint. Elias did not react. He merely regarded Stirling with calm, assessing silence, the kind that made lesser men sweat. Your business here is unwelcome, he said evenly. Oh, I assure you, it is both necessary and lawful. Sterling turned toward Isobel then, his eyes bright with predatory triumph. Lady Fairfax, he said, his voice carrying across the square, you are hereby summoned to London to answer for charges of fraud, deception, and interference in matters of inheritance. Should you refuse, the Crown will be compelled to act. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Isobel felt the world narrow, the edges of her vision tightening like a drawn string. Fraud, deception, charges meant not only to destroy her reputation, but to devour her freedom entirely. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elias stepped forward first, placing himself squarely between her and the man who had orchestrated her ruin. You will not use the Crown's name to pursue your personal schemes, Elias said, voice low, controlled, lethal. I know precisely what you intend to accomplish through these accusations, and I will see them dismantled. Sterling's lips curled. You overestimate your reach, Your Grace. The Fairfax name is damaged, the girl is compromised, and you, he let out a cold laugh. You have bound yourself to her so publicly that defending her will only implicate you further. Elias's jaw tightened, but still he did not step aside. If you wish to threaten me, do so directly. But you will not drag her back to London to face false charges. This is one. Oh, Sterling tilted his head. And who will stop me? I will, Elias answered. Silence fell, heavy, electric. Then, from behind him, Isobel stepped forward, her hand trembling only slightly as she touched Elias's arm, not to restrain him but to stand beside him. She looked directly at Sterling, the weight of every humiliation she'd endured burning into something fierce and unbreakable. You have taken my name, my home, my safety, she said, her voice steady as the tide. But you will not take my truth. I will not be your pawn. Sterling's expression flickered, surprise, then spite. Defiance suits you poorly, cousin. You lack the power to support it. Perhaps, she said softly. But I am not alone. The words hung between them like thrown gauntlets. Elias felt them, every syllable, like a vow pressed directly against his heart. And for the first time, Sterling hesitated. Sterling recovered quickly, too quickly. The brief flicker of hesitation vanished beneath a sneer, so polished it might have been practiced in a mirror. Touching, he said, dusting a speck of mud from his cuff as if brushing away her defiance. But sentiment changes nothing. The summons stands. If Lady Fairfax does not comply, the matter will escalate beyond your influence, Your Grace. He turned slightly, so the mounted guards behind him could be seen more clearly by the gathering villagers. It was a tableau crafted with meticulous cruelty, power arranged like pieces on a board, poised to crush the uncooperative. Children clung to their mothers. Men folded their arms across their chests, women exchanged nervous glances. Blackthorn Bay, once so welcoming, now felt like the stage of a play Isobel had never chosen to perform in. Yet she did not retreat behind Elias. She remained beside him, chin lifted, refusing to grant Sterling the satisfaction of fear. Elias's voice, when it came, was quiet, a quiet that held more threat than a shouted challenge ever could. You will revoke those charges, he said. You will withdraw the summons, and you will do so today, or I will see you face investigation for your dealings with the Fairfax solicitors, the forged correspondence you commissioned, and the attempted transfer of lands that do not belong to you. The words dropped into the cold morning air like stones into deep water, their weight rippling outward. Sterling blanched, only for a heartbeat, but Elias saw it. Everyone saw it. You have no proof, Sterling spat. I have enough, Elias replied, and I am prepared to gather the rest. His gaze sharpened. Do you imagine the Crown will ignore evidence of a nobleman forging documents to manipulate land boundaries tied to ducal estates? Or that they will overlook the coercion of a young woman whose only crime was becoming inconvenient to your ambitions? Sterling's mouth tightened as if tasting bitter metal. Careful, Your Grace. You are placing yourself in a very precarious position. And you, Elias said softly, are mistaking my restraint for weakness. A shiver ran visibly through the crowd. For months the villagers had known Mr. Raven as a polite, quiet stranger. Now they were beginning to understand the truth. The Duke of Ashbourne did not raise his voice. He did not posture or swagger or threaten blindly. He simply chose the moment he would act, and when that moment came, no force on earth could divert him. Seeing his advantage slip, Sterling changed tactics. His voice softened into familial concern, the false gentleness he wielded like a blade. Isobel, "My dear, surely you see how unfortunate this is becoming. If you simply sign the papers, all of this," he gestured vaguely, as if waving away the turmoil he had created, "can end. You can return home. You can restore your reputation." Isobel's breath caught, but she did not waver. "The only reputation I lost," she said, "was the one you stole." The words struck Sterling harder than Elias's threats. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, and for a moment, just a moment, his mask cracked, revealing the vicious frustration boiling beneath. "This is far from over," he hissed, stepping backward toward his carriage. "Both of you have overplayed your hand." When he climbed inside and the horses lurched forward, mud splashing beneath their hooves, the village remained frozen in a brittle silence. But in that silence, something monumental shifted. Men who had once doubted Isobel now exchanged worried glances. Women murmured her name with a mixture of sympathy and indignation. Children whispered that she had stood brave as a general. And Elias, still at her side, finally allowed himself a slow breath. "You were extraordinary," he murmured. Isobel turned to him, exhaustion softening every line of her face. "I was terrified." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Courage is fear," spoken with conviction. For the first time since her exile began, she felt the trembling edges of hope. Hope that perhaps she had not been cast out to die, but cast out to rise. The village did not return to its usual rhythm after Sterling's departure. Instead, a quiet vigilance settled over Blackthorn Bay, as though the wind itself paused at windows and doors to listen for the next strike. Isobel felt it everywhere, in the cautious smiles of neighbors, in the way market-goers lowered their voices when discussing anything remotely connected to London, in the lingering tension that clung to her shoulders no matter how many school lessons she completed or how many children's coats she mended. She moved through the days with a steadiness born not from calm, but from the knowledge that any moment might bring another summons, another accusation, another attempt by Sterling to force her hand. But beneath the fear lived something new, fragile and stubborn as a sprout breaking through frost: pride. Pride that she had stood her ground. Pride that she had spoken with a voice her family had spent years convincing her she did not possess. Elias visited often, not hovering, not intruding, but appearing at her cottage or the schoolhouse, with an instinctive understanding of when she needed a voice of reason or simply someone who would listen. He walked the cliff paths with her at dusk, offering neither apologies nor explanations for the kiss that still throbbed like a bruise in both their memories. Instead, he carried himself with the steady restraint of a man guarding the edges of something that might consume them both if mishandled. And in that silence, something simmered between them, something deeper and sharper than desire, something stitched from shared defiance, from battles fought side by side, from truths spoken only when the world threatened to break them. One evening, after collecting papers from the schoolhouse, Isobel found Elias waiting by her gate, coat unfastened, hair tousled by the wind. His expression was sober, but his eyes flickered with an intensity she had come to recognize as the precursor to difficult news. "A letter arrived," he said quietly, handing her the sealed parchment. Her heart twisted at the sight of the wax crest, Ashbourne's, not Sterling's. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a message from Elias's solicitor detailing what he had feared. Sterling had already petitioned certain London officials to proceed with an investigation. Though the evidence against him was mounting, so too was his influence, his lies now woven into official channels. Unless they acted swiftly, the matter could escalate beyond their ability to control it. Isobel read every line with growing dread, the ink blurring once before she forced herself to steady. "He means to destroy me," she whispered. "Even if he cannot drag me back to London, he intends to turn the law itself into a weapon." Elias stepped closer, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. "Then we do not wait for him to strike again," he said, voice carved from steel and something softer. "We go to him." The words sent a tremor through her. Not fear, not entirely, but the dizzying awareness of how profoundly her life had changed. Months ago she could barely imagine leaving her family home without a chaperone. Now she was contemplating confronting a powerful nobleman before the crown with only a duke by her side. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "No," he admitted, "but I am certain of this. I will not allow him to write the end of your story." Something inside her, something bruised but alive, lifted its head at those words. And for the first time since she had been cast into exile, she allowed herself to envision a world not shaped by shame, but by choice. Isobel's decision to accompany Elias to London was not made lightly. It weighed on her through the night, pressing into every crevice of her thoughts. She sat beside the dying fire long after the cottage had gone quiet, listening to the embers crackle like faint echoes of the life she had once lived. London had expelled her. London had swallowed her dignity whole. London was the place she had lost herself, and the place Stirling meant to bury her entirely. To return felt like stepping willingly into a cage. Yet the alternative, remaining in exile, waiting for the next whisper, the next forged document, the next threat, felt more like surrender than safety. When dawn crept through the shutters, pale and hesitant, her answer had crystallized into something cold, determined, and wholly her own. She would go, not as a penitent daughter dragged before judgment, but as a woman choosing the battleground on which she would reclaim her name. Elias arrived before the sun had fully risen, the sea wind clinging to his coat, and the weight of sleepless hours etched lightly around his eyes. When Isobel opened the door, he searched her face for hesitation. She met his gaze with steady resolve. "I'm ready," she said, voice scraped raw by fear and conviction alike. A flicker of relief crossed his features, relief, and something deeper that he hid behind the careful composure he always wore when the stakes were highest. He offered his arm, not as a formality, but as a vow. She took it. The journey south was long, marked by the muted clatter of carriage wheels and the ever-present scent of coastal mist trailing behind them like a memory. They rode in silence at first, each lost in private battles. But as the landscape shifted from wild cliffs to orderly hedgerows and then to the familiar hum of civilization, their silence grew taut with unspoken truths. Elias eventually spoke, his voice low. "You may face hostility when we arrive. The whispers will not have faded. Some will believe Stirling's lies simply because he spoke them." Isobel nodded, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know. And yet you go willingly," he added, something like admiration threading through his words. "Yes," she said softly, "because running has never saved me, and because I trust you." The carriage jolted slightly, but the shift inside Elias was sharper than any bump in the road. He turned his head, studying her with a depth that made her pulse unsteady. "You trust me," he repeated, almost as if testing the unfamiliar shape of the words. "Yes," she whispered again. "I do." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed into the space between them, a space charged with the memory of a kiss neither of them had spoken of since. But before either could breach the fragile certainty growing between them, the carriage slowed, halted, and London unfurled outside the window like a beast waking from slumber. Horse hooves clattered. Vendors shouted. Fog wove through the streets thick as judgment. She felt it all rush back, the humiliation, the stares, the weight of a world that had expelled her. Her breath wavered. Elias reached for her hand, not with possessiveness, not with presumptuousness, but with a quiet strength that anchored her when her courage trembled. "Isobel," he murmured, "you are not the girl they cast out." And with that single truth, she stepped out of the carriage, not into exile, but into confrontation. London greeted Isobel with a familiarity so sharp it bordered on cruelty. The streets she once glided through in silk and lace now felt colder, narrower, their polished facades gleaming with an indifference that pierced straight through her spine. Every echo of carriage wheels, every clipped footstep on cobblestone, every faint perfume lingering in the air reminded her of the night her world had collapsed, the night she had stood in a ballroom of glittering chandeliers while whispers devoured her like wolves. But this time she did not shrink. Her boots struck the ground with a steady rhythm that refused to mimic the trembling of her heart. Elias walked beside her, a silent shield of authority, guiding her through back entrances and quiet corridors known only to those accustomed to power. The closer they drew to the solicitor's office, the more Isobel felt the city's old grip tighten around her throat. Yet with Elias at her side, that grip no longer felt unbreakable. The building that housed Stirling's chosen firm was tall, severe, and trimmed in black iron. They were met not with a polite welcome but with a flustered receptionist who blanched at the sight of a duke and began tripping over apologies as she ushered them inside. The air smelled of ink, dust, and polished wood, an echo of all the legality that had once been wielded against her like a noose. Stirling himself was not present, but his solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, waited with a smugness so polished it might have been lacquered onto his skin. He rose just deeply enough to be courteous before sliding back into his chair with the confidence of a man certain of his victory. "Your Grace," Fenwick said, folding his hands, "and Lady Isobel, this is unexpected. I had assumed Lady Fairfax understood the gravity of the summons." Elias did not sit. "She understands the gravity of your deception," he said quietly. "That will be the subject of today's discussion." Fenwick blinked, slowly, calculatingly, before spreading several documents across the desk. "All in order," he said. "Signed and sealed. The Crown is prepared to proceed unless Lady Fairfax accepts the proposed trusteeship." Isobel stepped forward, forcing breath past the tension coiled in her chest. "A trusteeship that would strip me of all influence over my own inheritance," she countered. "One built upon forged letters, falsified accusations, and your client's greed." Fenwick smiled thinly. "Accusations such as these," he said, tapping a stack of paper, "require evidence." Elias leaned over the desk, his shadow stretching across the solicitor's neat rows of ink. "And evidence," he said, sliding a newly sealed envelope forward, "is exactly what we have brought." Fenwick froze. His eyes flicked to the seal, to the insignia of Ashbourne's private investigative office. For the first time, uncertainty cracked his expression. Inside the envelope lay sworn statements from handwriting experts confirming the forgery, correspondences between Sterling and the Fairfax solicitors that contradicted his public claims, recorded testimony from a dismissed clerk who had fled London after witnessing documents altered under threat, and, worst of all for Sterling, letters revealing his financial interest in the disputed land. The solicitor paled with every page he scanned. "This," Fenwick swallowed. "Your Grace, these are serious allegations." "They are serious crimes," Elias corrected, "and I have already arranged for them to be reviewed by the Crown's legal counsel." Isobel watched Fenwick collapse into uneasy silence, a silence that tasted like victory. The office that once symbolized her downfall now trembled under the weight of her truth. "This," she whispered, steady and sure, "is only the beginning." Elias glanced at her, pride softening the usual steel in his gaze, and for the first time in her life, Isobel stood in London not as a girl cast out in disgrace, but as a woman standing her ground. The journey back to Blackthorn Bay carried none of the dread that had shadowed their arrival in London. Instead, Isobel felt an unfamiliar lightness, fragile, cautious, but unmistakably alive, settling beneath her breastbone. The city that once devoured her dignity had been forced, at last, to swallow the truth instead. Fenwick had folded beneath the weight of Elias's evidence like wet parchment. By the time they departed his office, he could barely meet her gaze. By nightfall he had sent a written notice to the Crown's legal clerks, formally withdrawing the summons, citing procedural errors that neither Isobel nor Elias dignified with attention. And Sterling, cornered, exposed, fled London for the continent under the thin pretense of urgent health matters, leaving behind a trail of panicked solicitors scrambling to salvage what remained of his influence. For the first time in her life, Isobel had not survived a scandal. She had conquered it. Yet it was not triumph she felt as the carriage wheels hummed along the road toward the coast, but something gentler, deeper, so new she feared examining it too closely. Blackthorn Bay appeared at the horizon just as the sun was dipping low, turning the sea into molten copper. Villagers gathered as the carriage approached, some shy, some contrite, all curious. Children ran ahead, shouting breathless welcomes that made Isobel's throat tighten. She stepped out expecting pity or uncomfortable hesitation, but instead Mrs. Brigham seized her hands, muttering apologies for having doubted her. Mr. Tiller offered a crate of early-season apples for the schoolchildren, and even the butcher, who had once closed his shop in her face, insisted she take a parcel of smoked fish on the house. It was overwhelming, the warmth, the acceptance, the quiet acknowledgement that they had wronged her but wished to make it right. She received their gestures with humility, though her heart quivered beneath the weight of them. She had not fought for the village's favor, yet somehow, in fighting for her truth, she had earned it. Elias lingered at her side through each greeting, saying little, watching everything with the quiet vigilance that had become second nature to him. When the crowd thinned and the dusk settled into a soft blue haze, he walked with her toward the cliff path where everything between them had begun to shift. The wind tugged at her hair, the same wind that once chilled her to the bone, but now it felt like a familiar companion. She turned to thank him, for the evidence, the courage, the shield he had become, but the words tangled in her chest. Not because they were insufficient, but because they were too small. Elias stepped closer, the fading light catching the grain of gold in his eyes. "You do not owe me gratitude," he said softly. "What you reclaimed yourself. And yet," she whispered, "I could not have faced any of this alone." He hesitated then, as he always did when emotion threatened the disciplined edges of his composure. "You were never alone," he said, voice scarcely above breath. "Not even when you believed you were." The truth trembled between them. She reached for his hand, tentative, uncertain, but he caught her fingers with quiet certainty, as though he had been waiting for this moment longer than he dared admit. The tension that had shadowed them for months dissolved like mist as he drew her into his arms, not with the urgent desperation of that first reckless kiss, but with steady reverence, as if he were embracing the freedom they had both fought so hard to reach. Their lips met, slow, deliberate, unhurried, carrying none of the fear that had once restrained them. Only truth, only promise, only the quiet miracle of two people who had survived exile, not by withdrawing from the world, but by finding one another within it. When they finally parted, the sea roared softly below, the village hummed peacefully behind them, and for the first time since her disgrace, Isobel felt her future open like a sunlit path, not as a fallen daughter, not as a woman rescued, but as the equal of the man who had chosen to walk beside her, into freedom, into hope, into whatever life awaited them next.